The screaming started at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Maple Grove Circle, a sound so primal and desperate that Mrs. Henderson dropped her coffee mug on her kitchen tiles. Three children collapsed on the pristine sidewalk, their small bodies convulsing as they clawed at their burning eyes. Thick streams of chemical irritant clouding the suburban air like poison fog. The youngest, barely 10 years old, gasped for breath that wouldn't come, his chest heaving against lungs that seemed to be closing from the inside out. Daniel Martinez had been drawing hopscotch squares with purple chalk just minutes before, his pudgy fingers carefully sketching the numbered boxes, while his friends Marcus and Sarah cheered him on. The cul-de-sac of Willowbrook Estates had always been their safe haven, a quiet street where children could play without fear, where the biggest concern was whether Mrs. Kim would chase them away from her rose bushes. Today, that sanctuary became a battlefield. The morning had begun like any other Tuesday in their suburban neighborhood. Daniel's mother, Dr. Elena Martinez, had kissed him goodbye at 7:30 a.m. before rushing to her shift at Metropolitan General Hospital, where she served as head of emergency trauma surgery. "Remember to take your inhaler if you run around too much," she had called from the driveway, her voice carrying the practiced concern of a mother who understood the fragility of her son's respiratory system. Daniel had nodded dutifully, patting the pocket of his backpack where the small blue inhaler rested like a lifeline. At 11 years old, he had learned to navigate the world with severe asthma, a condition that made every breath a conscious act, every physical activity a calculated risk. But in the safety of Maple Grove Circle, surrounded by friends who understood his limitations, he could almost forget about the invisible chains around his lungs. The children had finished their homework by 3:15 p.m., gathering in the small courtyard where the street curved into a gentle circle. Marcus Thompson, a hefty 12-year-old with an infectious laugh, had suggested hopscotch after finding a box of sidewalk chalk in his garage. Sarah Chen, 10 and tiny but fierce, had immediately claimed the pink chalk, declaring herself the official scorekeeper. Daniel, always eager to please despite his physical limitations, had chosen purple and begun sketching the playing field with meticulous care. "Make the squares bigger." "Danny," Marcus had called out, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "We're not little kids anymore." "These are perfect," Sarah had protested, hands on her hips in mock indignation. "Besides, Danny's an artist. Look how straight those lines are." Daniel had smiled, his round face flushing with pride and mild exertion. The chalk felt smooth between his fingers as he added the final touches to their playing field, completely unaware that Karen Whitfield was watching from her living room window 3 houses down. Her lips pursed in disapproval. Karen had moved to Willowbrook Estates 18 months ago, immediately volunteering for every committee and board position available. At 52, she was a woman who thrived on order and control, someone who measured her worth by the number of violations she could cite and rules she could enforce. Her appointment as head of community standards had been unanimous, mainly because no one else wanted the thankless job of policing their neighbor's garbage can, placement, and lawn maintenance schedules. What started as vigilant community oversight had slowly morphed into something darker. Karen found herself patrolling the streets with increasing frequency, her clipboard thick with violation notices and her authority expanding with each successful complaint. She had citations for improper holiday decorations, warnings for children's bikes left on front lawns, and strongly worded letters about the appropriate decibel levels for backyard gatherings. The sight of 3 children drawing on the sidewalk sent her into immediate action. She grabbed her official clipboard, her digital camera, and the newly issued citation book that gave her a sense of power she had never experienced before. The fact that the children were playing quietly, bothering no one, and clearly staying within the bounds of their own neighborhood seemed irrelevant. In Karen's mind, they were violating the sanctity of community standards. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she marched down Maple Grove Circle, her face set in grim determination. The children looked up as she approached, their innocent faces showing confusion rather than fear. They had no way of knowing that Karen had been building toward this moment for weeks, that her frustration with what she perceived as declining neighborhood standards had been festering like an infected wound. "Excuse me," Karen announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You children are obstructing pedestrian traffic and defacing public property." Marcus straightened up, his young face creased with confusion. "We're just playing hopscotch, ma'am. We live here." "That's irrelevant," Karen snapped, clicking her pen with aggressive precision. "This sidewalk is public property, and you're intentionally creating obstacles for foot traffic. Furthermore, you're vandalizing the concrete with unauthorized markings." Sarah looked down at the cheerful chalk drawings, her small voice barely audible. "It washes away when it rains. We've done this lots of times." "Previous violations don't excuse current ones," Karen replied, her clipboard now in full view as she began writing. "I'm citing all three of you for loitering, vandalism, and obstruction of public pathways." Daniel felt his chest beginning to tighten, the familiar sensation that warned him of approaching respiratory distress. Stress was one of his triggers, and the angry woman's presence was sending his system into alert mode. He reached instinctively for his pocket, seeking the comfort of his inhaler's familiar shape. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice rising with indignation. "Our parents let us play here all the time." Karen's face flushed crimson, her authority challenged by a 12-year-old's logic. "Your parents clearly haven't taught you respect for community standards. Look at you three, blocking the entire walkway, being deliberately idle and disruptive." The word idle hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah glanced at her friends, sensing the shift in atmosphere from playful afternoon to something much more sinister. "We can move if someone needs to walk by," she offered quietly. "It's too late for compromises," Karen declared, her voice rising to a pitch that carried across the quiet neighborhood. "You've already violated multiple community standards. And frankly, children of your size shouldn't be lounging around on sidewalks anyway. It sends the wrong message about our neighborhood's commitment to health and fitness." The cruel comment about their weight hit like a physical blow. Marcus and Daniel, both carrying extra pounds that made them targets for playground bullies, felt the familiar sting of adult judgment. Sarah, though small, recognized the attack on her friends and stepped forward protectively. "You can't talk to us like that," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We're not doing anything wrong." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you arguing with a community official that's insubordination and disrespect toward authorized personnel?" She pulled out her cell phone, waving it like a weapon. "I'm calling your parents and reporting this behavior." Daniel's breathing became more labored, the stress triggering the bronchial spasms that made every breath a struggle. He fumbled for his inhaler, his small hands shaking as he tried to remove it from his pocket. The device slipped from his nervous fingers, clattering onto the chalk-marked sidewalk. "What's that?" Karen demanded, pointing at the inhaler with suspicion. "Are you doing drugs? Is that why you're loitering out here? To use illegal substances?" "It's just his asthma medicine," Marcus said quickly, bending to retrieve the inhaler for his friend. "Danny has trouble breathing sometimes." "Likely story," Karen sneered, her paranoia now in full display. Troubled children often use medical excuses to cover their drug use. I'm confiscating that device as evidence. She reached for the inhaler, but Marcus pulled it back protectively. You can't take his medicine. He needs it. The confrontation escalated with frightening speed. Karen, feeling her authority challenged by children who dared to question her judgment, reached into her purse and withdrew a small canister that gleamed menacingly in the afternoon sunlight. The pepper spray had been a recent addition to her enforcement toolkit, purchased online after reading about aggressive youth behavior in neighborhood forums. "Step back immediately," she commanded, raising the canister with shaking hands. "You're becoming aggressive and confrontational. I'm authorized to use necessary force to maintain order." The children froze, their young minds unable to process the escalation from playground dispute to weapon threat. Daniel wheezed audibly now, his face pale and sweaty as his respiratory system struggled against the mounting stress. Sarah grabbed his arm supportively, while Marcus stood protectively in front of both younger children. "We're just kids," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't hurt us." Karen's finger hovered over the spray trigger, her face twisted with righteous indignation and unchecked power. "You should have thought about consequences before defying community standards and resisting authority." Without warning, without further discussion, without any regard for the children's ages or the minor nature of their supposed infractions, Karen Whitfield pressed the trigger. The pepper spray erupted in a concentrated stream, catching all three children in a cloud of burning chemicals that sent them instantly to their knees. The screaming began immediately. Marcus, caught full in the face, clawed at his eyes as tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the chemical irritant to create rivers of fire across his skin. Sarah doubled over, retching violently as the spray invaded her nose and throat, her small body convulsing with each gasping breath. But it was Daniel whose response was most terrifying. The 11-year-old's already compromised respiratory system went into complete crisis. The pepper spray triggered an immediate and severe asthma attack, his airways constricting so rapidly that he could barely manage the smallest sip of air. His lips turned blue as oxygen levels plummeted, his small hands reaching desperately for the inhaler that lay just inches away, but might as well have been miles. Karen stood over the writhing children, her face a mask of satisfaction and shock. "Maybe now you'll learn to respect authority," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and misplaced pride. "This is what happens when you resist community standards." Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house at a run, her coffee-stained apron flying behind her as she rushed toward the chaos. "What have you done?" she screamed at Karen, immediately dropping to her knees beside Daniel, whose breathing had become a terrifying whistle of failing airways. "Call 911. This child is dying." Other neighbors began streaming from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the children's agonized cries. "Mr." Kim grabbed his garden hose, spraying fresh water over Marcus and Sarah's burning faces, while his wife called emergency services. The peaceful suburban afternoon had transformed into a scene of medical crisis and community outrage. Karen backed away from the growing crowd, her pepper spray canister still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "They were resisting authority," she repeated, as if the phrase could justify the chemical assault on children. "They were violating community standards and being deliberately confrontational." "You attacked children with a weapon," Mrs. Henderson shouted, her hands pressing against Daniel's chest as she tried to help him breathe. "Look at them. Look what you've done." The sirens began wailing in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles raced toward Willowbrook Estates. Daniel's condition continued to deteriorate, his small body going limp as oxygen deprivation took its toll. Mrs. Henderson performed rescue breathing while Mr. Kim continued spraying water over the boy's face, trying to wash away the chemical irritants. "Where's his mother?" someone called out from the growing crowd of neighbors. "Doctor," Martinez is at the hospital. Mrs. Henderson replied between rescue breaths. She's the trauma surgeon at Metropolitan General. A collective gasp went through the gathered neighbors as the implications sank in. Dr. Elena Martinez was not just Daniel's mother. She was one of the most respected medical professionals in their community, a woman who saved lives daily and commanded enormous respect, both locally and in regional medical circles. Karen had just chemically assaulted the child of someone whose professional reputation and connections could bring devastating consequences. The first ambulance arrived with screaming sirens and flashing lights, paramedics jumping out before the vehicle had fully stopped. They immediately went to work on Daniel, administering oxygen and emergency medications while establishing IV access for more aggressive treatment. The second ambulance crew treated Marcus and Sarah, flushing their eyes and providing supportive care for the chemical burns. "What happened here?" the lead paramedic demanded, his hands working quickly to stabilize Daniel's breathing. "She sprayed them with pepper spray," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing an accusatory finger at Karen, who had retreated to the edge of the crowd. "3 children playing hopscotch, and she attacked them with chemicals." The paramedic's face darkened with professional outrage. "Ma'am, we need to transport this child immediately. He's in severe respiratory distress." "Which hospital?" "Metropolitan General," Mrs. Henderson replied. "His mother works there. Dr. Elena Martinez in trauma surgery." The paramedic's eyes widened in recognition. Dr. Martinez was legendary in the local medical community, known for her skill, her dedication, and her fierce advocacy for patient safety. "Radio ahead," he called to his partner. "Tell them, Dr. Martinez's son is coming in with severe chemical exposure and respiratory crisis. Have her standing by." As the ambulances pulled away with their precious cargo, the neighbors turned their attention to Karen, who stood clutching her pepper spray canister like a shield. The woman who had felt so powerful just minutes before now faced a crowd of outraged parents and community members whose protective instincts had been fully activated. "You're done," said Bob Chen, Sarah's father, his usually quiet voice filled with cold fury. "Whatever authority you think you had, it's over. You attacked our children." Karen's face had gone pale, the reality of her actions beginning to penetrate through her self-righteous anger. "I was enforcing community standards," she said weakly. "They were being disruptive and disrespectful." "They were playing hopscotch." "Mrs." Kim shouted, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by maternal rage. "You used a weapon on children for drawing with chalk." Police officers began arriving on scene, their radio chatter filling the air as they tried to make sense of the situation. Detective Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had seen every kind of domestic dispute imaginable, looked around the chalk-marked sidewalk with growing incredulity. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, pulling out his notebook. "You pepper-sprayed 3 children for playing hopscotch." Karen straightened her shoulders, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. "I was enforcing community standards as an appointed official. The children were loitering, vandalizing public property, and resisting lawful orders." Detective Rodriguez looked down at the colorful chalk drawings, then back at Karen with undisguised disbelief. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault with a chemical weapon against minors. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs clicked shut around Karen's wrists as neighbors pulled out their cell phones, documenting every moment of her arrest. The woman who had terrorized their children was finally facing consequences, but the cost had been almost unbearable. At Metropolitan General Hospital, Dr. Elena Martinez was scrubbing in for an emergency surgery when her pager began buzzing with urgent codes. She glanced at the display and felt her blood turn to ice. Her son's name appeared alongside chemical exposure and respiratory crisis. The surgical instruments clattered to the floor as she ran toward the emergency department, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Daniel on a ventilator, his small body dwarfed by the medical equipment fighting to keep him alive. His face was swollen and red from the chemical burns, but it was the mechanical breathing apparatus that made her legs nearly give out. Her baby, her precious boy with the gentle heart and artistic hands, was fighting for every breath. Elena called Dr. Patterson, the attending emergency physician. "We've got him stabilized, but he went into severe bronchospasm. The pepper spray triggered a massive asthma attack." Dr. Martinez's professional training warred with her maternal instincts as she reviewed Daniel's chart with shaking hands. "How long was he without adequate oxygen?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. The neighbors started CPR immediately, and paramedics were on scene within 8 minutes. "We're monitoring for any neurological effects, but early signs are encouraging." She pulled up a chair beside Daniel's bed, her surgeon's hands gentling as she touched his swollen face. "Who did this to him?" she whispered. "Some HOA official, apparently. She pepper-sprayed 3 kids for playing hopscotch. The other 2 are being treated for chemical burns. But Daniel got the worst of it because of his asthma." Dr. Martinez felt something cold and implacable settle in her chest. She had dedicated her life to healing, to repairing the damage that violence and negligence inflicted on innocent people. But someone had deliberately attacked her child, had used a chemical weapon against a vulnerable boy whose only crime was playing with his friends. Over the next several hours, as Daniel slowly began to breathe on his own again, Dr. Martinez made a series of phone calls. Her first was to Dr. Sarah Williams, president of the State Medical Association and a longtime colleague. Her second was to Dr. Michael Chen, who served on the board of the American Pediatric Society. Her third was to Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, who happened to host the most popular medical podcast in the country. Each conversation was professional, measured, and devastating in its implications. Dr. Martinez didn't rant or threaten. She simply shared the facts a community official had used chemical weapons against children, causing severe respiratory distress in a known asthmatic. The medical community's response was swift and unforgiving. Meanwhile, back in Willowbrook Estates, word of the incident had spread through social media and neighborhood networks like wildfire. Parents who had tolerated Karen's excessive enforcement suddenly realized how close their own children had come to similar attacks. The security cameras that had captured the entire incident became the most damning evidence imaginable. The footage was clear and undeniable: 3 children playing quietly, a woman approaching with obvious aggression, the brief confrontation, and then the chemical attack that left them writhing on the ground. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, each view generating fresh outrage and disbelief. Local news stations picked up the story first, but it was the medical media outlets that gave it national attention. Dr. Rodriguez's podcast dedicated an entire emergency episode to chemical weapons used against asthmatic children, featuring interviews with pediatric specialists who explained in devastating detail what pepper spray could do to compromised respiratory systems. The American Medical Association issued a statement condemning the attack and calling for criminal prosecution. The National Asthma Association held a press conference demanding justice for Daniel and highlighting the life-threatening nature of chemical irritants for asthmatic individuals. Medical professionals across the country began sharing the story, adding their professional weight to the growing outcry. Karen's arrest photo became a symbol of unchecked authority and community power run amok. Legal experts appeared on news programs explaining how her actions constituted assault with a deadly weapon. Given Daniel's known medical condition and the severity of his reaction, the fact that she had attacked children over sidewalk chalk made the story even more compelling for national media. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting within 48 hours of the incident. The community center filled beyond capacity as residents demanded answers and accountability. Karen had been released on bail, but her position was immediately terminated and all her authority revoked. "This woman terrorized our children in the name of community standards," said Marcus's father. Addressing the packed room, "She turned our neighborhood into a police state where kids can't play hopscotch without fear of chemical attack." The HOA board faced brutal questioning about how Karen had been given such broad authority and why there had been no oversight of her enforcement activities. Several board members resigned that night, acknowledging their failure to protect the community's most vulnerable residents. Dr. Martinez arrived at the meeting directly from the hospital, still wearing her scrubs and carrying the exhaustion of a mother who had spent 2 days watching her child fight for breath. When she stood to speak, the room fell completely silent. "My son almost died because a woman decided that children playing hopscotch threatened her vision of community order," she said, her voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "Daniel will recover physically, but the trauma of being attacked by an adult authority figure will take much longer to heal." She paused, looking around the room at faces filled with shame and outrage. "But this isn't just about my son. It's about what we allow to happen in our community when we give unchecked power to people who see children as problems to be solved rather than treasures to be protected." The applause was thunderous and sustained. A community finally united in support of their children against the authority that had failed them so spectacularly. Karen's legal troubles mounted with each passing day. The district attorney, under intense public pressure and facing overwhelming evidence, filed multiple felony charges, including assault with a chemical weapon, child endangerment, and abuse of authority. Medical experts testified about the life-threatening nature of pepper spray exposure for asthmatic individuals, while child psychologists explained the lasting trauma of adult violence against children. The defense attempted to portray Karen as an overzealous community volunteer who had made a mistake in judgment. But the video evidence and medical testimony painted a picture of deliberate cruelty against defenseless children. Her own words, captured on security cameras, demonstrated clear intent to harm and punish rather than any legitimate law enforcement purpose. During the trial, Daniel took the stand with his mother's support, his small voice describing the terror of being unable to breathe while adults stood over him with weapons. Marcus and Sarah also testified, their accounts of the attack bringing several jurors to tears. The community rallied around the children, filling the courtroom with support and ensuring that their voices were heard. The prosecution played the security footage multiple times, each viewing revealing new details of Karen's aggressive behavior and the children's obvious innocence. Expert witnesses explained how chalk drawings posed no threat to anyone, how children playing in their own neighborhood had every right to use public sidewalks, and how pepper spray could kill an asthmatic child. Karen's conviction on all charges was swift and unanimous. The judge, a father of 3, delivered a scathing rebuke along with the maximum sentence allowed by law. "You used a weapon against children engaged in innocent play," he said during sentencing. "Your actions endangered lives and betrayed every principle of community service and child protection." Beyond the criminal penalties, Karen faced civil lawsuits from all 3 families that would leave her financially devastated for years. The medical bills alone from Daniel's hospitalization exceeded her ability to pay, and the emotional damages awarded by the jury reflected the community's outrage at her actions. 6 months after the attack, Daniel had physically recovered, but still carried his inhaler everywhere and startled whenever adults raised their voices. Doctor Martinez had arranged for counseling for all three children, and slowly, they were beginning to heal from the trauma of being attacked by someone they should have been able to trust. The Willowbrook Estates community had undergone a fundamental transformation. New HOA leadership implemented strict oversight policies and eliminated all enforcement positions that carried weapons or punitive authority. Children's rights were explicitly protected in the community charter, and regular family events were organized to rebuild the sense of safety and belonging that Karen's reign of terror had destroyed. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the attack, Daniel knelt on the same sidewalk where he had nearly died, carefully drawing hopscotch squares with purple chalk. Marcus and Sarah flanked him protectively, their friendship forged stronger by the trauma they had survived together. Other neighborhood children had joined them, creating an impromptu chalk art festival that filled the street with laughter and creativity. Dr. Martinez watched from her front porch, her heart full of gratitude for her son's recovery and pride in their community's resilience. The chalk drawings that had once been deemed criminal violations were now celebrated as expressions of childhood joy and artistic freedom. Where Karen had seen problems to be eliminated, the community now saw treasures to be protected. "Mom, look," Daniel called out, his voice strong and clear. "We're making a rainbow." She smiled, watching as her son and his friends created something beautiful from simple chalk and concrete, their laughter echoing through a neighborhood that had learned the true meaning of community standards, protecting the vulnerable, nurturing creativity, and ensuring that children could play without fear. The sidewalk art would wash away with the next rain, but the lessons learned from tragedy would endure forever, carved into their hearts like permanent chalk on an unchanging surface. The sun began to set over Maple Grove Circle, casting long shadows across the colorful drawings that transformed ordinary pavement into a canvas of hope. In the distance, other children's voices joined the chorus of play, a symphony of healing that proved no authority figure could permanently silence the joy of childhood or the strength of a community united in protection of its most precious residents. As darkness fell and the children gathered their chalk, heading home to families who held them a little tighter now, the rainbow drawings remained visible in the streetlight's glow, a testament to resilience and a promise that such darkness would never again be allowed to overshadow their small corner of the world.